Battle of Birch Coulee was the most deadly for Minnesotan forces in the Dakota War conflict. The survivors had battled for roughly 30 hours or more without food or water. 47 soldiers were severely wounded, 22 killed, and 90 horses were killed. The Dakota only reported 2 deaths in the ambush. Colonel Sibley was training his forces at Fort Ridgely, preparing them for the march upstream. Both the Dakota and the Minnesotan forces were at a sort of a stalemate. The Dakota wouldn't take on Fort Ridgely head-on or push southward, and the Minnesotan forces wouldn't move upstream into hostile territory without more reinforcements, equipment, or training, which was still on its way from Fort Snelling. The Minnesota River Valley was at a standstill, so Little Crow decided to sweep across the plains to raid small towns to the west of Minneapolis. Much of the small towns in Minnesota had been abandoned over the last few weeks. Carver County had hundreds of women and children retreating eastward. When news hit Wright County, Rockford, the only town with a bridge across the Crow River at the time, was filled with refugees heading east. As the civilians fled eastward, volunteer militia and soldiers rushed westward with their rifles and ammunition. Little Crow moved in on the Forest City settlement, very close to the site of the initial attack that had started the war. Soldiers had been posted in the region, and luckily for them, a messenger had warned the unaware unit that 100 Dakota warriors were nearby and closing in. The soldiers had little training and unfortunately much of the wrong caliber ammunition. Desperate, the lead officer ordered the soldiers to fix bayonets and charge to the south. The soldiers broke through Little Crow's lines and made a dash for the city of Hutchinson. As they ran, the men would fire at the Dakota, reload, run, and fire again. Eventually, the Dakota had lost pursuit. They had lost 3 men, 9 horses, 2 wagons, all their supplies, and up to 24 men were wounded when they arrived in Hutchinson. Hutchinson was later attacked the same day. The Dakota burned the outlying buildings, and reinforcements arrived from Glencoe that evening to save the town from a siege. 3 more Minnesotans were killed in the skirmish, but it saved the town. To the south, soldiers had been arriving at Fort Ridgely from the front lines of the Civil War, bringing ammunition, artillery, and other provisions. Correspondence had began between Sibley and Little Crow. Little Crow said that he had several hundred hostages he had taken on his raids, and rumor was, should the Dakota warriors lose, he would take their captives with them. Sibley said he would not negotiate without Little Crow's unconditional surrender. Neither side would budge, so it became clear that further military action would need to be taken. Sibley, however, was unwilling to make a push into Little Crow's territory without a substantial assurance they could hold their own without more reinforcements from Fort Snelling. His first push west should be his last. The Minnesotan population was getting anxious. Sibley was not a military commander. In the past, he was a fur trader who had a history of working with the Siouan tribes. Voices arose attacking his supposed lack of leadership. Jane Gray Swisshelm was a newspaper editor and a journalist in St. Cloud. When Abraham Lincoln was nominated for the presidency, she spoke and wrote on his behalf. When the Civil War broke out, she volunteered as a nurse on the front line. She was also a Civil War heroine who was placed in the charge of 182 badly wounded men after the Battle of Wilderness in Virginia. The battle was the first of many between Generals Grant of the Union and Lee of the Confederacy. Jane Gray Swisshelm had no surgeon or assistant for 5 days, and all 182 men were saved. Now in St. Cloud, she spoke up against Sibley. For God's sake, put some live man in command of the force against the Sioux and let Sibley have 100 men or thereabout for his undertaker's corpse. These words only helped grow contempt for Sibley among the Minnesotan populace. Little Crow had been having issues of his own. The Dakota were divided. Natives of the Dakota territories were against the war, and they knew that every day it went on, it would be harder on their people. Notable Dakota chiefs denounced Little Crow and his brutality against the whites. Civilian Christian leaders and Dakota friendly to whites took great risks to save, protect, and negotiate care for the hostages. Little Crow was losing the support of his fellow chieftains. 17 days after the defeat at the Battle of Birch Coulee, Sibley marched out of Fort Ridgely upstream into the Sioux reservation. His goal was to defeat Little Crow once and for all. Little Crow took his war bands from the Dakota territory and prepared for his arrival. This is the beginning of the end of the Dakota War.